Welcome back to the Oxford Real Estate Report. This episode is going to discuss the NCAA's opposition to Trinidad Chambliss's petition. In the prior episode, we walked carefully through Trinidad Chambliss's petition and the legal framework he relies on in seeking an additional year of NCAA eligibility. That discussion focused entirely on the petitioner's allegations, medical narrative, and interpretation of the NCAA's waiver standards. Today's episode completes the picture. This episode explains the case from the NCAA's point of view, based exclusively on the NCAA's response in opposition to Chambliss's motion for a preliminary injunction. Everything discussed here reflects how the NCAA frames the facts, the governing bylaws, the medical record, and the role of the court in eligibility disputes. As always, a brief disclaimer. I'm an attorney, but this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing here is legal advice, and I am not representing any party involved in this matter. Before we dive into the NCAA's response, there's another piece of this story that matters, especially to listeners who think in terms of community economics and real estate rather than law alone. Trinidad Chambliss's eligibility isn't just a legal question for college football. It's also a question that resonates economically because the performance and stability of the University of Mississippi football program are deeply connected to the vibrancy of Oxford's real estate market. Let's unpack how. There are a few ways that successful football seasons boost housing demand and market strength in a college town. 1. Heightened visitation raises short-term occupancy and rental demand. When tens of thousands come into town for games or playoff weekends, hotels, short-term rentals, and investor-owned units see near 100% occupancy and higher rates. 2. Sustained success strengthens long-term demand for housing. Colleges that are competitive on the field often see more applications, more faculty and staff interest, and more student enrollment growth, all of which supports demand for rentals and homes, especially near campus. 3. Tight inventory translates to rising rents and property values. In college towns with constrained supply, which Oxford is, strong demand tied to the university and athletics can push rent growth above national averages. Now, please don't take the above to mean that every home and condo buyer in Oxford wakes up thinking about NCAA eligibility. But it does mean that developers and investors factor university-linked demand, including athletics, into their risk models. In other words, a dispute about a single player's eligibility can turn into a community-wide economic conversation because Oxford's identity and economic engine are tightly interwoven with the success and stability of its football program. So as we step back into the legal analysis, remember this. The NCAA's arguments about eligibility are not just abstract rules. For Oxford, they touch on economic realities that impact housing demand, investment confidence, and community growth. And that's why this story matters, not just to lawyers and fans, but to anyone who watches this market. With that, let's walk through the NCAA's response. The NCAA begins by characterizing this lawsuit as a challenge to the core structure of collegiate athletics governance. According to the NCAA, it is a voluntary, self-governing association composed of colleges, universities, and athletic conferences. Those member institutions collectively establish eligibility rules through the Division I manual. Among the most fundamental of those rules is the 5-year rule, which limits student athletes to a maximum of 4 seasons of intercollegiate competition within a 5-year window that begins with initial full-time enrollment. The NCAA emphasizes that these rules are not imposed unilaterally. They are adopted by the membership, agreed to by institutions, and accepted by student athletes as a condition of participation. From the NCAA's perspective, this case is not about the wisdom of those rules, but about whether courts should displace the governance structure that member institutions created. The NCAA's first substantive argument is jurisdictional and structural rather than factual. It argues that Mississippi law sharply limits judicial involvement in the internal decisions of private voluntary membership organizations. According to the NCAA, courts may intervene only when a decision violates a clear contractual provision or an independent legal duty. Mere disagreement with the outcome or allegations of unfairness are insufficient. The NCAA stresses that eligibility determinations are not administrative agency decisions and are not subject to arbitrary and capricious review. Instead, they are internal determinations governed by the association's rules. From the NCAA's standpoint, allowing courts to reweigh evidence or reinterpret eligibility standards would effectively convert judges into appellate eligibility panels. In short, the NCAA's position is that courts are not designed and not authorized to supervise eligibility decisions made under NCAA bylaws. Additionally, the NCAA argues that even assuming the court reaches the merits, the waiver was correctly denied under its bylaws. The NCAA does not dispute the basic timeline of Chambliss's collegiate career. It acknowledges that he participated in only 3 seasons of intercollegiate competition, but emphasizes that he exhausted his 5-year eligibility window. As a result, the only mechanism available to permit additional competition is an extension of eligibility waiver. According to the NCAA, extension waivers are intentionally narrow. They are not designed to ensure every athlete receives 4 seasons of competition, but to provide limited relief in defined circumstances. The bylaws require that a student athlete be deprived of more than one opportunity to compete within the 5-year period, and that the deprivation be supported by specific evidence. The NCAA's response then moves to addressing medical incapacity and the contemporaneous documentation requirement. Where a waiver is based on medical incapacity, the NCAA's rules require contemporaneous medical documentation, clearly establishing that the athlete was unable to compete due to an incapacitating condition. The NCAA emphasizes that this requirement is not discretionary. Contemporaneous documentation is the foundation of the analysis because it reflects medical judgments made for treatment purposes. At the time, the condition existed, not retrospective assessments developed after eligibility consequences become apparent. The NCAA acknowledges that its guidelines permit consideration of non-contemporaneous medical evidence, but it stresses that such evidence can only supplement contemporaneous records. It cannot substitute for them, and it cannot override them when the contemporaneous records contradict a claim of incapacity. After the NCAA addresses its approach regarding medical incapacity and the contemporaneous documentation requirement, it then begins to apply its thoughts on the 2022 to 2023 medical records. According to the NCAA, the contemporaneous medical records from the 2022 to 2023 season do not establish incapacity. The records reflect that Chambliss was evaluated for tonsil-related issues shortly before the season. Rather than undergoing surgery, he opted for medication management so that he could continue participating in football. The NCAA emphasizes that this choice is significant because surgery would have interfered with participation, while medication was intended to allow continued activity. The NCAA further points to follow-up treatment notes at the end of the season, in which Chambliss reported that he was doing very well and had not experienced significant symptoms. From the NCAA's perspective, these records affirmatively contradict a claim that he was unable to compete. Critically, the NCAA stresses that none of the contemporaneous records state that Chambliss was medically prohibited from competition or restricted due to incapacity. It then proceeds to discuss the distinction between non-participation and incapacity. The NCAA places substantial weight on the distinction between not competing and being unable to compete. According to the NCAA, the fact that Chambliss did not appear in games during the 2022 to 2023 season does not, standing alone, establish medical incapacity. Eligibility rules turn on ability, not opportunity. An athlete may be on the roster, medically cleared and physically capable of competing, yet still not play due to depth chart position or developmental considerations. The NCAA argues that this distinction is critical and that the waiver framework is designed to address incapacity, not competitive outcomes. NCAA doesn't stop with the above, but continues to argue against Chambliss's claims. The NCAA makes it known it believes it has a consistency and credibility argument to be made against Chambliss's claims. According to the response, Chambliss later competed during a season in which his medical condition was allegedly worse than it had been in 2022 to 2023. Despite that, he played in every game, led his team to a national championship, and earned major individual honors. From the NCAA's perspective, this later performance undermines the claim that Chambliss was incapacitated during the earlier season. If he was able to compete at a high level during a period of greater reported symptoms, the NCAA argues it was not reasonable to conclude that he was unable to compete when his condition was reportedly less severe. The NCAA also relies on representations made by Ferris State University. According to the response, Ferris State did not characterize the 2022 to 2023 redshirt decision as medically driven. Instead, the institution described it as developmental and competitive. The NCAA argues that institutional representations are relevant because waiver applications are submitted by schools, not athletes, and those representations inform the NCAA's evaluation. From the NCAA's standpoint, the absence of contemporaneous institutional documentation describing incapacity further supports denial of the waiver. Now, I know this is a lot of information. We're almost done. The last part of the NCAA's response addresses why the court should not grant injunctive relief, balance of equities, and impact on other athletes, and its systemic and institutional concern. Even if the court were to disagree with the NCAA's eligibility analysis, the NCAA argues that Chambliss cannot meet the legal standard for a preliminary injunction. Under Mississippi law, a preliminary injunction requires a showing of likelihood of success on the merits, irreparable harm, a balance of equities favoring the petitioner, and consistency with the public interest. The NCAA argues that Chambliss fails each element. The NCAA contends that eligibility loss does not constitute irreparable harm where professional opportunities remain available. It also argues that speculative harms, such as potential awards or increased NIL opportunities, are insufficient to justify extraordinary relief. Next, the NCAA places significant emphasis on the effect of injunctive relief on others. According to the NCAA, granting one athlete an additional year of eligibility necessarily displaces others. Roster spots, playing time, and NIL opportunities are finite. Granting relief to Chambliss would come at the expense of other student athletes who are not before the court. The NCAA argues that this broader impact weighs heavily against injunctive relief and supports uniform enforcement of eligibility rules. Finally, the NCAA situates this case within a broader national context. It warns that allowing courts to function as appellate bodies for eligibility disputes would destabilize collegiate athletics. If individual judges can override eligibility determinations, the NCAA argues that uniform governance becomes impossible and litigation becomes the default mechanism for eligibility disputes. From the NCAA's perspective, even hard cases cannot justify dismantling a system designed to apply consistently across institutions, conferences, and sports. In closing, the NCAA frames its argument as a straightforward application of clear bylaws, supported by contemporaneous medical evidence, and protected from judicial reweighing. While Chambliss frames his petition case as a failure to fairly apply waiver standards to his individual medical circumstances. As the case develops, I'll continue to monitor filings and rulings and revisit it when there's something meaningful to analyze. Thanks for listening to the Oxford Real Estate Report.